By the summer of 1503, the Borgia family held the papacy, controlled a growing state across central Italy, and placed more than 10,000 soldiers under Cesare Borgia's command in Rome. Then on August 18th, Pope Alexander VI died while Cesare lay dangerously ill. Within months their enemies returned, their cities defected, and their dynasty began to disintegrate. How could 11 years of ruthless power collapse because of one death? On April 8, 1455, the College of Cardinals chose an unlikely pope. Alfonso de Borja was an elderly jurist from Valencia, not the leader of a great Roman clan. Rival factions accepted him as a compromise. He took the name Calixtus III. In that moment, a family still known by its Valencian name gained access to the highest office in the Western Church. Alfonso had been born on December 31, 1378, at Torre de Canals near Satava, in the Kingdom of Valencia. His father belonged to a lesser branch of a local landowning family. The strongest asset available to him was education. At 14, Alfonso entered the University of Lleida, where he studied civil and canon law. After earning his doctorate, he taught there and acquired a reputation for legal reasoning and administration. Those abilities brought him to the attention of King Alfonso V of Aragon. Beginning as a royal secretary, the young lawyer became a trusted counselor and negotiator in the complicated relationship between kings, rival popes, and church councils. His advancement was not sudden. In 1429, Alfonso helped persuade the last surviving rival claimant from the Western Schism to renounce his title at Peñíscola. The achievement helped restore religious unity in the lands of Aragon and brought Alfonso the bishopric of Valencia. In 1443, he helped negotiate the Treaty of Terracina between King Alfonso and Pope Eugene IV. The following year, the Pope made him a cardinal. Alfonso then left royal service and settled in Rome. During 11 relatively quiet years as a cardinal, he lived austerely and avoided the most aggressive court factions. Contemporary descriptions gave him a reputation for modesty and personal incorruptibility. That record matters because the later Borgia legend can make every member of the family appear to have entered Rome already surrounded by poison, sexual scandal, and murder. The evidence shows a different beginning, a disciplined legal career followed by decades of royal and ecclesiastical service. The crisis that raised Alfonso to the papacy began before the conclave. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, alarming Christian courts across Europe. Alfonso was known as a committed advocate of a new crusade. Once elected, he vowed to make resistance to Ottoman expansion the central work of his pontificate. He sent legates and preachers across Europe, raised money, reduced court expenses, and ordered the construction of a papal fleet. The response from European rulers was disappointing. Their wars and rivalries mattered more to them than a united expedition. Even so, papal representatives assisted the resistance in Hungary, where John Hunyadi and the Franciscan preacher, John of Capistrano, helped break the Ottoman siege of Belgrade in 1456. The papal fleet later defended Christian positions in the Aegean and defeated an Ottoman force near Lesbos. But it lacked the reinforcements needed for the grand campaign Calixtus wanted. His legal background also appeared in a different case. At the request of Joan of Arc's mother and surviving brothers, Calixtus authorized a formal review of the proceedings that had condemned Joan for heresy in 1431. The new tribunal heard extensive testimony. On July 7, 1456, it annulled the original judgment, finding that the earlier process had been corrupted by deceit and procedural abuse. Calixtus did not personally retry Joan, but his authorization made the judgment possible. Yet the same pontificate that pursued these public causes also established the mechanism of Borgia power. Calixtus surrounded himself with relatives and men from the crown of Aragon. A foreign pope facing hostile Roman barons could regard family members as dependable servants. They were also extraordinary beneficiaries of his authority. His nephew Rodrigo de Borja, educated in canon law at Bologna, was made a cardinal in 1456. The next year, Calixtus appointed him vice-chancellor of the church, placing the young man near the center of papal administration. Another nephew, Luis Juan de Mila, also entered the College of Cardinals. Rodrigo's brother, Pedro Luis de Borja, known in Italy as Pier Luigi, received military commands, fortresses, the Duchy of Spoleto, the government of Castel Sant'Angelo, and the office of prefect of Rome. This was nepotism in its most consequential form. There is little evidence that Calixtus simply emptied the Italian church to finance a luxurious household. He was personally frugal, and much of his spending went toward the crusade. But he undeniably transferred offices and political opportunity to relatives and fellow Catalans, displacing members of established Roman families. Resentment grew around a court increasingly regarded as foreign. When Calixtus died on August 6, 1458, that resentment broke into open hostility. Catalan officials fled, Borgia positions were attacked, and Pedro Luis escaped Rome only to die during his flight. The family's first experiment in papal power appeared to be collapsing after little more than 3 years. Rodrigo, however, remained a cardinal. His uncle had given him more than wealth. He possessed legal training, institutional office, and a permanent place among the men who elected popes. Calixtus had opened Rome to the Borgias, but his death showed how quickly borrowed power could vanish. One nephew, however, had learned how to survive without the pope who raised him. When Pope Calixtus III died in August 1458, Rodrigo de Borja was only 27 years old. He was a foreign cardinal in a city turning violently against the Catalan officials promoted by his uncle. Rodrigo remained near the dying pope, then entered the conclave that would choose a successor. His first test was no longer gaining favor. It was surviving the loss of the man who had created his career. Rodrigo supported the election of Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius II. The choice protected Rodrigo's position. He remained vice-chancellor of the church, an office Calixtus had given him in 1457. He would keep it under Pius II, Paul II, Sixtus IV, and Innocent VIII. 4 popes inherited the Borgia official and kept him. The vice-chancellorship placed Rodrigo at the working center of papal government. The chancery prepared important papal documents and handled a constant flow of legal and administrative business. Rodrigo learned how petitions moved, how appointments were negotiated, how revenues were collected, and how favors created alliances. His training in canon law gave him the necessary technical knowledge. Decades inside the office gave him something more valuable, an understanding of how the church functioned as both a religious institution and a territorial power. It also made him rich. Rodrigo accumulated benefices, meaning income-producing church offices and properties across several kingdoms. He administered bishoprics including Valencia and Cartagena, held the wealthy abbey of Subiaco, and eventually became one of the senior cardinal bishops. Contemporary observers counted him among the richest members of the College of Cardinals. Some of that fortune began with his uncle's patronage, but it continued growing long after Calixtus was gone. Rodrigo's career was not confined to a desk. Sixtus IV sent him to the Iberian Peninsula as a papal legate in 1472. There he dealt with royal politics, church discipline, and crusade plans, returning with greater diplomatic experience and renewed Iberian ties. By then he had shown that nepotism had opened the door, but competence kept him inside. Competence did not mean restraint. In 1460, Pius II sent Rodrigo a severe reprimand after hearing reports about a private celebration in Siena attended by women and excluded husbands and male relatives. The exact conduct at the gathering cannot be reconstructed with confidence. Rodrigo apologized while disputing part of the account, and the Pope accepted his explanation only in part. The episode does not prove every later tale about him, but it shows that concern about his behavior began decades before he became pope. His private life soon became inseparable from his political future. Rodrigo fathered several children, some before his relationship with Vanosa de Catanei. Between the middle 1470s and early 1480s, Vanosa bore the 4 children who would become central to the Borgia story: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Rodrigo acknowledged them and arranged their futures with unusual care for a cardinal whose office required celibacy. The children were not raised as an ordinary household. Cesare received church benefices and an education suited to an ecclesiastical career. Juan was positioned to inherit the family's secular interests in the Duchy of Gandia. Lucrezia's future engagements offered possible alliances with Italian nobles. Geoffrey could also be placed within a marriage network. Long before their father became pope, the family was being organized along separate lines of church office, landed title, and political marriage. Rodrigo also wanted the papacy. When Sixtus IV died in 1484, he mounted a serious campaign in the conclave. He attracted support from Italian powers, Roman barons, and Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, yet his wealth and alliances were not enough. Opposition to a foreign pope remained strong, while rivals questioned his character and reliability. Once his own prospects failed, Rodrigo supported Giovanni Battista Cibo, who became Innocent VIII. That defeat changed his strategy. Rodrigo strengthened his alliance with Ascanio Sforza, whose family ruled Milan, while Giuliano della Rovere led an opposing network. When Innocent died in July 1492, the next conclave became a struggle between these competing groups. Rodrigo was now past 60, enormously wealthy, experienced in administration, and ready to distribute the offices and benefices he had accumulated. The conclave opened in the Sistine Chapel on August 6th. After the first ballots failed to produce a winner, Ascanio threw his support behind Rodrigo. Promises of offices, properties, and income helped secure additional votes. Ascanio later received the vice-chancellorship and Rodrigo's former palace. Other cardinals also benefited. Contemporary evidence makes it difficult to dismiss the charge of simony, the exchange of material advantage for influence in a sacred election. The most colorful stories about mule loads of silver are less secure, but the broader pattern of bargaining is clear. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo was elected and took the name Alexander VI. His victory was not created in one night. It rested on 36 years of law, administration, wealth, diplomacy, patronage, and preparation. Yet the same resources that made him pope placed suspicion over the election from its first morning. For 36 years, Rodrigo had lived close to the papal throne. In August 1492, he finally occupied it and turned a private family into a public problem. After his coronation in August 1492, Pope Alexander VI moved quickly to restore order in Rome. He heard petitions, demanded firmer justice, and supported measures intended to restrain the violence that troubled the city. These early acts encouraged hopes that the experienced former vice-chancellor would govern with discipline. Yet the office he had won was more complicated than a royal throne. Alexander led the Western Church, controlled appointments and revenues, negotiated with monarchs, and ruled the Papal States. But much of that rule depended on cooperation, patronage, and alliances rather than unquestioned command. The Papal States stretched across central Italy, but they were not a modern centralized country. Powerful Roman families, especially the Orsini and Colonna, possessed fortresses, armed followers, and political connections. Beyond Rome, local lords governed towns in the Pope's name while often behaving as independent princes. The papacy could issue laws, collect income, hire soldiers, and impose spiritual penalties, but it did not possess a permanent army capable of dominating every baron or resisting a major European invasion. Alexander therefore began his reign with impressive authority and limited coercive power. He also brought his family closer to the machinery of government. On August 31, 1492, he appointed his son Cesare Borgia as Archbishop of Valencia. On September 20, 1493, Cesare became a cardinal, although he was still a young man and had not followed the ordinary course of an ecclesiastical career. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, whose support had helped Alexander in the conclave, received influence and office. Spaniards and Valencians entered the papal household and administration in increasing numbers. To supporters, these were trusted servants of a pope surrounded by rivals. To critics, they were evidence that public authority was being converted into family property. Alexander's relationship with Julia Farnese strengthened that impression. The relationship itself is well attested, as is the access that petitioners sought through her. Her brother Alessandro Farnese was among the men raised to the cardinalate in 1493. Later writers surrounded Julia with stories that cannot all be verified. Claims that her face appeared as the Virgin Mary in the Borgia apartments belong to later tradition, not secure identification. The documented problem was already serious enough. Intimacy, patronage, and advancement had become visibly connected at the center of the church. The same mixture of spiritual and temporal authority appeared in Alexander's Atlantic policy. After the first voyage of Christopher Columbus, the Castilian monarchs sought papal support for their claims. In May 1493, Alexander issued a series of bulls granting Castile rights in lands west of a designated line, provided those lands were not already ruled by a Christian prince, and linking expansion to evangelization. These documents are often described as the Pope dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. That summary is misleading. Portugal did not simply accept a papal settlement. The two crowns negotiated directly, and the Treaty of Tordesillas shifted the line in 1494. The episode showed the reach of papal legitimacy, but also its limits. Even Catholic monarchs treated a papal decree as part of diplomacy, not the final word. Those limits became dangerous in Italy. Giuliano della Rovere, a powerful cardinal and bitter opponent of Alexander, withdrew from Rome and encouraged French intervention. King Charles VIII of France claimed the Kingdom of Naples through the Angevin line. In 1494, he crossed into Italy with an army whose artillery could break medieval fortifications at alarming speed. The divided Italian states failed to create a durable common defense. Alexander tried negotiation, alliance, and delay, but the French advance demonstrated that legal claims and ecclesiastical prestige could not stop cannon. Charles entered Rome on December 31, 1494. Alexander took refuge within the fortified Vatican precinct and negotiated rather than risk a battle he could not win. Some of the Pope's enemies wanted the king to summon a council and challenge Alexander's election. Charles did not depose him. Under the agreement reached on January 15, 1495, French forces received passage through papal territory and temporary control of the port of Civitavecchia. Cesare joined the royal expedition as papal legate, officially representing his father, but his presence also guaranteed Alexander's compliance. In practical terms, the Pope's son was a hostage. Alexander had preserved his throne, yet the settlement exposed the weakness beneath Borgia influence. Soon after the French departed Rome, Cesare escaped from the royal column in disguise and returned to papal territory. Charles continued toward Naples, but his success frightened former allies as well as enemies. On March 31, 1495, Alexander joined Venice, Milan, Spain, and Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in the League of Venice. Its members combined forces to contain French power. Charles eventually withdrew from Italy, although the campaign had already broken the old political balance. The crisis supplied a clear answer about the early Borgia regime. Its strength came from law, office, diplomacy, revenue, and the distribution of favors. It did not yet come from an army loyal enough to protect the Pope or his children against a king with disciplined troops and heavy guns. Alexander had survived the French king, but survival changed the purpose of his papacy. From this point forward, his children would become instruments of government. On June 16, 1497, the body of Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, was recovered from the Tiber River. He had suffered multiple wounds and still carried money, making simple robbery an unlikely explanation. Juan, often called Giovanni by Italian contemporaries, had been the son Pope Alexander VI intended to establish as the family's secular prince and military protector. His murder did more than take a life. It destroyed the division of roles Alexander had created for his children. That division reflected the logic of Renaissance dynastic politics. Cesare Borgia had been directed toward the church, becoming an archbishop and then a cardinal. Juan inherited the Spanish Duchy of Gandia and was prepared for command, land, and marriage within the nobility. Lucrezia Borgia became an instrument of alliance. Geoffrey Borgia, the youngest, was assigned a similar purpose. Their father's papal authority determined their careers, but it also restricted their choices. Their titles, marriages, and futures changed whenever the balance of Italian power changed. Lucrezia was about 13 when she married Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, in June 1493. The match connected the Borgias to the Sforza network governing Milan and strengthened Alexander's relationship with Cardinal Ascanio Sforza. Lucrezia's youth was not unusual for an elite marriage agreement, but the arrangement demonstrates how little personal independence such alliances allowed. When Milan ceased to be useful, her marriage would also lose its value. In May 1494, Joffre married Sanchia of Aragon, a daughter of King Alfonso II of Naples. The couple received the Principality of Squillace. This marriage supported Alexander's developing alliance with the Neapolitan branch of the House of Aragon, while France threatened the kingdom. One child had linked the family to Milan. Another now linked it to Naples. The papal household had become a map of competing alliances, and every diplomatic reversal placed strain on the people holding those connections together. Juan was recalled from Spain in 1496 and appointed captain general of the papal army despite limited experience in independent command. Alexander wanted to punish the Orsini, whose support for the French invasion had exposed the papacy. The campaign began with gains against several Orsini possessions, but the fortress of Bracciano resisted through the winter. On January 25, 1497, relief forces defeated the papal army near Soriano. Juan's troops fled, and much of the territory taken earlier was recovered by the barons. The failure did not end Alexander's plans for his son. In June, Juan received the Duchy of Benevento and the lordships of Terracina and Pontecorvo, territories belonging to the Papal States. The grants provoked objections because property of the church was being shaped into a hereditary Borgia domain. Only days later, Juan disappeared after a family supper at the home of his mother, Vanosa de Catanei. His body was found in the river after a search ordered by the Pope. An investigation followed, but it produced no proven murderer. Contemporary suspicion moved among the Orsini, political enemies connected to the Sforza family, Joffre, and private enemies Juan may have made. Cesare eventually became the most famous suspect. He benefited politically from his brother's death, and later acts of violence made the accusation seem believable to generations of writers. Yet benefit is not proof. The earliest rumors did not center on Cesare, and no surviving evidence establishes that he ordered or committed the murder. The responsible conclusion is that Juan's killer remains unknown. Alexander's grief briefly altered his government. He declared that reform should begin with himself and appointed 6 cardinals to prepare changes for the papal court. Their proposals addressed abuses involving offices, benefices, and church property. A draft reform bull was produced, but it was never formally issued, and only a small portion of the program was attempted. The moment revealed that Alexander understood the institutional damage caused by nepotism. It also showed that recognition without sustained action could not change the system he had built. Meanwhile, Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza was being dismantled. With the alliance between Alexander and Milan broken, the Pope sought an annulment on the ground that the marriage had not been consummated. Giovanni resisted the humiliating demand that he acknowledge impotence in relation to the marriage, then yielded under pressure. The union was declared invalid in December 1497. Sforza retaliated with accusations of incest involving Lucrezia and her family. No decisive evidence supports those allegations, but they spread through hostile courts and later histories. They became a foundation of the Borgia Black legend, transforming a political divorce into a story of sexual crime. By the beginning of 1498, Alexander's family strategy had been reordered by failure and death. Lucrezia was available for a new alliance. Joffre's marriage still connected the family to Naples. Juan's hereditary project had lost its adult leader. Cesare remained a cardinal, but the secular path once reserved for his brother was now open. Juan's killer remained unknown, but the political result was unmistakable. The family's military future now passed to the son who had been dressed for the church. On August 17, 1498, Cesare Borgia received permission to surrender the cardinal's hat. No cardinal had voluntarily abandoned that rank in generations. Cesare was ending the career Pope Alexander VI had designed for him in childhood, but he was not leaving papal power behind. He was preparing to use it in another form. The family needed a secular heir, and Cesare intended to become a prince. The transformation required an international sponsor. Alexander's alliance with Naples had weakened, while Louis XII of France was preparing new claims in Italy. The French king also needed papal assistance to end his marriage to Jeanne of France and marry Anne of Brittany. Alexander supplied the necessary authorization for a canonical investigation, and the marriage was declared invalid. In return, France offered Cesare a princely position abroad. Cesare arrived in France with papal favors for the king and his advisors. Louis made him Duke of Valentinois, provided income and troops, and admitted him to the Order of St. Michael. In May 1499, Cesare married Charlotte of Albret, sister of the King of Navarre and a woman connected to the French royal court. The marriage gave him noble legitimacy beyond Rome. French protection gave him something even more important, an army strong enough to turn papal judgments into conquest. Alexander supplied the legal foundation. Several rulers in Romagna governed as papal vicars, holding cities from the church in exchange for tribute and obedience. The Pope declared that certain lords had failed in those obligations and had therefore forfeited their rights. These proceedings asserted an authentic papal claim, but their selective enforcement served an unmistakable family purpose. The territories were to return not to neutral papal administration, but to control under Cesare. In the autumn of 1499, French success against Milan opened the road into Romagna. Cesare advanced with French troops and experienced Italian commanders. Imola surrendered, followed by its fortress. At Forlì, Caterina Sforza refused to accept the judgment that had removed her family. The city fell, but she continued resisting from the fortified citadel. After bombardment and assault, the fortress was taken in January 1500. Caterina became Cesare's prisoner and was eventually confined in Castel Sant'Angelo before French intervention helped secure her release. The limits of Cesare's independence appeared almost immediately. When Louis recalled French soldiers to confront a renewed threat in Milan, Cesare had to suspend his campaign. He returned to Rome, received the title of Captain General of the Church, and prepared another army. Papal finances sustained the effort. Revenue associated with the Holy Year of 1500, fees connected to offices, and the creation of new cardinals strengthened Alexander's ability to raise money. Cesare also recruited commanders whose loyalty rested on payment and opportunity, not devotion to a Borgia state. The renewed campaign began late in 1500. Giovanni Sforza abandoned Pesaro, and the Malatesta ruler left Rimini, allowing Cesare to occupy both cities with limited resistance. Faenza proved different. Its young lord, Astorre Manfredi, retained local support, and the city resisted through the winter. Cesare resumed the siege with French reinforcements, and Faenza surrendered in April 1501. He had demonstrated persistence, effective use of artillery, and an ability to combine diplomacy with force. Yet every victory still depended on papal authority, borrowed soldiers, and a coalition of ambitious captains. While Cesare built a French-backed dominion, Lucrezia's second marriage connected the family to the opposing dynasty. In July 1498, she married Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie and an illegitimate son of a former king of Naples. Surviving reports indicate that Lucrezia became genuinely attached to him. When Alfonso briefly fled Rome in 1499, Alexander appointed his pregnant daughter to govern Spoleto and Foligno. The assignment was limited and supervised, but it shows that Lucrezia could be entrusted with administrative responsibility. She was not simply a silent object exchanged between men. The French alliance made her husband politically dangerous. In July 1500, Alfonso was attacked near St. Peter's Basilica and badly wounded. Lucrezia and Sancia of Aragon helped care for him while he recovered. On August 18th, armed men led by Cesare's trusted officer Michelotto Corella entered Alfonso's rooms. The wounded duke was killed. Contemporary testimony, the identity of the men involved, and Cesare's political interest make his responsibility highly credible. No surviving written order proves the precise chain of command, but this case is far stronger than the unsupported claim that Cesare murdered Juan. Alfonso's death severed another tie to Naples. By 1501, Alexander was negotiating Lucrezia's third marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to Ferrara. The Este family resisted because of her reputation and the dangers of association with the Borgias, but papal pressure and French influence made refusal costly. Once again, Lucrezia's future followed the direction of Cesare's foreign policy. Cesare's achievements were real, but they were never his alone. He combined personal decisiveness with papal decrees, church revenues, French troops, and commanders whose allegiance could change. Those resources won cities, but they did not yet create durable obedience. Cesare had conquered with papal authority and French soldiers. To keep what he had taken, He would have to convert conquest into a state and remove the men who understood how dependent he still was. On December 31st, 1502, Cesare Borgia entered Senegalia and greeted commanders who had recently rebelled against him. He then had his soldiers separate the men from their troops and arrest them. The operation was more than revenge. It exposed the central problem of Cesare's new state. The commanders who helped create it possessed armies, territories, and ambitions of their own. The state had grown rapidly after the fall of Faenza in April 1501. Its young ruler, Astorre Manfredi, had surrendered under terms that were supposed to protect him. Cesare nevertheless took him into custody and sent him to Rome. Astorre and his half-brother later disappeared while held in Castel Sant'Angelo and were killed. Their deaths in Borgia custody were widely attributed to Cesare's agents. The surviving evidence does not establish the exact circumstances or preserve a written order from Cesare. With Faenza secured, Alexander granted his son the title Duke of Romagna. Cesare then expanded beyond the region. In 1502 he seized Urbino, forcing Duke Guidobaldo da Montefeltro to flee. Camerino also fell, and its ruling family was removed. The conquests alarmed Florence, Bologna, Venice, and the military captains whose own lordships might become his next targets. Cesare did not merely extract wealth and move on. He appointed governors, placed troops in fortresses, divided his territories into administrative districts, and strengthened ducal supervision over justice and taxation. Local councils continued many ordinary functions, so this was not a wholly new bureaucracy. The most important judicial measure was a central court of appeal intended to serve the entire duchy. Cesare was attempting to bring communities long divided among rival lords under a single authority. The project was incomplete, but it was recognizably a government rather than a temporary camp. Order was enforced through fear. Cesare appointed Ramiro de Lorqua as governor and lieutenant general of Romagna. Ramiro suppressed factional violence but was accused of extortion, arbitrary government, and brutality. On December 22, 1502, Cesare had him arrested. 4 days later, his dismembered body was displayed in the main square of Cesena. Years afterward, Niccolò Machiavelli argued that Cesare had allowed a harsh minister to pacify Romagna and then sacrificed him, transferring public hatred from the ruler to the servant. That interpretation became a classic lesson in political theater. The execution itself is confirmed, as are the official accusations against Ramiro. Cesare's precise intention is not. Machiavelli's dispatch at the time admitted that the reason was unclear. His later explanation in The Prince was an interpretation of the event, not a transcript of Cesare's plan. Cesare also employed technical expertise. In 1502, Leonardo da Vinci entered his service as a military engineer and architect. Leonardo inspected fortifications, roads, waterways, and strategic positions across Cesare's territories. His surviving map of Imola, drawn with unusual geometric precision, reflects this work. It was not simply a work of art. It provided the kind of measured urban information useful for defense, movement, and control. Cesare's court briefly joined military expansion with some of the most advanced surveying knowledge available in Italy. Machiavelli encountered this court as an envoy of the Florentine Republic. His task was to observe Cesare, protect Florentine interests, and report on an unpredictable neighbor. During these months, Cesare's mercenary captains met at Magione. Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, Paolo Orsini, Francesco Orsini, Duke of Gravina, and their allies feared that Cesare's expansion would eventually destroy them. Their rebellion helped restore Guidobaldo in Urbino and threatened to unravel the Borgia conquests. Cesare survived because the rebels were divided and because he repaired his relationship with King Louis XII of France. French protection and reinforcements changed the balance. Cesare negotiated with the conspirators, accepted declarations of renewed loyalty, and waited until his forces were stronger. He then directed them toward Senegalia, where the city's fortress had not yet surrendered. When Cesare arrived on the final day of 1502, his apparent allies came forward to receive him. Once isolated, they were seized. Vitellozzo and Oliverotto were strangled soon afterward. Paolo Orsini and the Duke of Gravina remained prisoners until they too were killed. The purge removed commanders who had demonstrated that their allegiance could not be trusted. It also revealed how Cesare governed a coalition whose loyalty ultimately depended on calculation and fear. Violence ended the immediate conspiracy, but it could not provide a secure succession or detach his duchy from papal approval. Machiavelli later made Cesare a central example in The Prince. Some readers have treated him as the author's model of effective rule. Other scholars emphasize the warning within the same account. Cesare tried to escape dependence on mercenaries, France, and his father, yet his greatest successes still relied on what Machiavelli called the arms of others. His administration created more order than the image of a simple plunderer allows, but its foundations had not been tested by a transfer of power. By early 1503, Cesare appeared stronger than any regional lord he had displaced. He possessed cities, fortresses, officials, and a reputation that inspired obedience and fear. What he did not possess was independent legitimacy, an established succession or military power entirely his own. Every road to his new state still led back to one aging man in Rome. On May 31, 1503, Pope Alexander VI created 9 new cardinals. The appointments strengthened the Spanish and Borgia-aligned presence in the College of Cardinals, but they also produced substantial payments for the papal government. Alexander needed money as Cesare Borgia raised troops to defend his territories. Political strategy, church government, and private dynastic interest had become difficult to separate. The clearest charge is corruption through office. Simony meant buying or selling spiritual offices, benefits, or sacred authority. During the conclave of 1492, Rodrigo Borgia promised offices, property, and influence to cardinals whose votes he needed. The precise details vary among contemporary reports, and claims that every vote was purchased with cash go beyond the surviving evidence. But the distribution of rewards after his election supports the conclusion that material promises played an important role. Alexander continued practices already present in the Renaissance papacy, including the accumulation of benefices and the use of appointments to reward political service. Under his rule, however, these methods became exceptionally visible. Curial offices were sold, payments accompanied some promotions, and new cardinals helped raise funds. Not every act of patronage was technically simony, but treating ecclesiastical office as a financial and political resource damaged the independence expected of church government. Nepotism is even less disputed. Alexander advanced Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, Geoffrey, and numerous other relatives through titles, marriages, benefices, commands, and territorial grants. Church fortresses, revenues, soldiers, and legal authorities supported Cesare's project in Romagna. Other popes favored relatives, but comparison does not remove responsibility. Alexander used an office belonging to the wider church to build a hereditary future for his children. His private life also violated the standards of his position. Alexander acknowledged children born outside marriage and maintained sexual relationships while holding senior clerical office. The exact number and parentage of every child attributed to him remain uncertain, but the existence of several children and his relationship with Julia Farnese are well established. These facts required no invention by his enemies. They gave hostile writers a credible foundation on which less reliable accusations could grow. The conflict with Girolamo Savonarola shows how religious reform and politics overlapped. The Dominican preacher condemned corruption in Rome, but he was also associated with a Florentine government aligned with France, Alexander's most dangerous foreign pressure. The dispute involved Savonarola's preaching, claims to prophetic authority, refusal to obey papal restrictions, and Florence's diplomatic position. Alexander excommunicated him in 1497. After Savonarola lost political support, Florentine authorities arrested and tried him. 2 papal commissioners participated in the final stage of a coercive and deeply flawed process. Savonarola was hanged and his body burned on May 23, 1498. Alexander helped destroy him, but the execution was not simply a private papal murder. The evidence for violence around Cesare is substantial. His forces broke surrender terms, eliminated defeated rulers, and executed commanders after the trap at Senegalia. The killing of Lucrezia's second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, is strongly connected to Cesare through contemporary testimony and the participation of his trusted officer. These cases justify describing Borgia politics as violent. They do not prove every murder later assigned to the family. Juan Borgia's killing remains unsolved. No surviving evidence identifies Cesare, the Orsini, the Sforza, or a private enemy as the murderer. The incest accusations involving Lucrezia emerged during the bitter collapse of her marriage to Giovanni Sforza and were repeated by political opponents. They have never been supported by evidence sufficient to establish a sexual relationship with her father or brothers. Repetition enlarged the accusation without strengthening its foundation. The same problem surrounds poison. Renaissance courts knew arsenic and other toxic substances, and poisoning was a genuine political fear. Yet the famous image of Lucrezia carrying a poison ring, or the Borgias routinely using a secret family substance called cantarella, lacks documentary support proportionate to its fame. Suspicion intensified because the papal treasury could benefit from vacancies and contested property after a cardinal's death. Consequently, an unexpected death could become a Borgia poisoning before any cause was known. The so-called banquet of chestnuts requires greater caution. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, recorded a sexually explicit gathering involving Cesare's apartments in 1501. Burchard was a contemporary official and an important witness, so the entry cannot be dismissed merely because it is scandalous. However, its most notorious details depend on one principal account and lack comparable confirmation from multiple independent observers. It should therefore be presented as a serious contemporary report, not as an event established beyond dispute. Diplomatic letters, Burchard's diary, Savonarola's sermons, and reports from rival courts remain essential sources. They also came from participants with political, religious, or personal interests. Later Protestant polemicists selected the most damaging stories and made Alexander a symbol of corruption in the entire Roman Church. Subsequent literature added poison, incest, and calculated murder until the family became less a dynasty than a vocabulary for evil. The Black Legend was neither pure fabrication nor a reliable record. The Borgias committed enough documented abuses to deserve judgment: nepotism, monetized office, misuse of papal resources, sexual misconduct, and political violence. They also made enough enemies to attract invention. When Alexander soon fell ill, these two realities would merge, and every symptom would be interpreted through the reputation his family had created. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died in Rome. At the same moment, Cesare Borgia was seriously ill and unable to direct the political crisis forming around him. The family still possessed money, fortresses, soldiers, and cardinal support. Alexander's death did not merely remove its leader, it removed the legal authority holding the entire territorial project together. Alexander and Cesare had fallen ill during the dangerous Roman summer. Rumors soon claimed they had accidentally consumed poison prepared for a wealthy cardinal. The story matched their reputation, but no reliable evidence confirmed such a plot. Contemporary reports describe fever, and sickness was widespread in Rome. Malaria or another infection is plausible, but diagnosing a disease across 5 centuries remains uncertain. Johann Burchard recorded that Alexander's body swelled, darkened, and decomposed rapidly. Later writers treated this description as proof of poison. It is not. Rapid decomposition can result from heat, infection, the interval before burial, and other conditions that cannot now be reconstructed. Burchard provides evidence for the body's appearance, not a toxicological examination. The cause of Alexander's death cannot be established with complete certainty, although an acute natural illness fits the surviving reports better than the accidental poisoning story. Cesare was not immediately powerless. He secured approximately 100,000 ducats from his father's treasury and had more than 10,000 soldiers in or near Rome. Yet he did not control Castel Sant'Angelo, and numbers did not give him a monopoly of force. Armed Orsini and Colonna returned to the city. A French army stood to the north near Viterbo, while Spanish forces approached from the south. Each power could influence Rome, and none intended to let Cesare dictate the next papal election. His illness magnified every weakness. Cesare needed to remain in Rome because his titles as papal vicar and captain depended on confirmation by the next pope. He also needed to be in Romagna because displaced families were returning to their cities. He could not act decisively in both places, and for a critical period, he could barely act at all. Guidobaldo da Montefeltro returned to Urbino. Other former rulers reappeared in Camerino, Pesaro, Rimini, and Piombino. Soldiers began seeking more secure employment. Cesare retained support among Spanish cardinals and had French backing, but France and Spain were now fighting for dominance in Italy. Their factions could not agree on a candidate Cesare controlled. The cardinals forced him to withdraw from Rome and preserved enough independence to elect Francesco Piccolomini as Pope Pius III on September 22. The new pope confirmed Cesare as Captain General and Vicar of Romagna, but he was already gravely ill. He died on October 18, after a reign of less than 1 month. A second conclave gave Cesare another chance. Giuliano della Rovere had been one of Alexander's most determined enemies, but he wanted the papacy and needed Spanish votes. Cesare supported him after receiving promises that his command and territories would be protected. Della Rovere became Pope Julius II on November 1. He initially issued confirmations intended to prevent chaos in Romagna, but the alliance served its purpose only until his election was secure. Julius intended to restore the conquered cities to direct papal authority, not preserve a hereditary Borgia state. Faenza sought Venetian protection, Fano rejected Cesare's government, and Venice occupied positions across Romagna. Julius demanded the surrender of the fortresses that remained loyal to Cesare. When he resisted, the Pope had him arrested. By early 1504, the state built in his name had effectively ceased to exist. Cesare was eventually allowed to leave for Naples, where he attempted to organize a return to Italy. The Spanish commander Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba arrested him, partly because Spain wanted good relations with Julius and did not want Cesare reopening the conflict. He was transported to Spain and imprisoned first at Chinchilla and later in the castle of La Mota at Medina del Campo. Neither France nor Spain was willing to restore the man both had once used. In 1506, Cesare escaped by descending from a window and found refuge with his brother-in-law, King John III of Navarre. The former Duke of Romagna entered the king's service against rebellious nobles. During fighting near the fortress of Viana, Cesare became separated from his men. He was surrounded and killed on March 12, 1507. He died not as the ruler of an Italian state, but as a commander serving another monarch. No single cause explains the speed of the collapse. 5 forces combined. Alexander died suddenly. Cesare became ill at the same decisive moment. Romagna depended on papal titles rather than independent legitimacy. Cesare's soldiers and diplomacy relied heavily on France and other outside powers. Finally, displaced lords and Roman barons returned as soon as papal protection disappeared. Trusting Julius was a serious miscalculation, but it accelerated a crisis already created by these structural weaknesses. Cesare had prepared for enemies, rebellions, and war. He had not created a succession that could survive the Pope who made his authority lawful. His state disappeared, but the Borgia family did not. Lucrezia remained Duchess of Ferrara. Juan's descendants continued the line of Gandia, and other branches survived in Spain and Italy. The final question was no longer how the Borgias lost Rome, but what, beyond the Black Legend, they left behind. A critical edition associated with the State Archives of Modena brings together 727 known letters written by Lucrezia Borgia between 1494 and 1519. This evidence reveals a woman discussing government, money, property, family, diplomacy, and religious obligations. It is a record unlike the familiar image of a seductress whose instruments were poison and sexual intrigue. Lucrezia entered Ferrara in February 1502 and married Alfonso d'Este, heir to the duchy. The Este family had initially resisted the match. They questioned her legitimacy, feared her reputation, and demanded major political and financial concessions before accepting her. Lucrezia therefore arrived not as an unquestioned princess, but as a young woman required to establish her value within one of Italy's oldest courts. She succeeded before and after Alexander's death. When Alfonso became duke in 1505, Lucrezia became Duchess of Ferrara. She performed ceremonial duties, received petitions, represented the ruling family, and participated in government during her husband's absences. Alfonso often placed male relatives beside her, so her authority was neither absolute nor modern. It was nevertheless real. Her letters show familiarity with military preparations, appointments, negotiations, and the daily work of maintaining a court during war. Lucrezia also developed an independent economic position. She used agents and credit, acquired estates, and supported projects that drained wetlands and converted them into productive farmland. Her interests included grain, livestock, textiles, and the management of rural income. At court, she supported writers, musicians, religious houses, and charitable activity. These achievements should not be used to transform her into a flawless heroine. The correspondence shows an active Renaissance noblewoman who pursued family interests, cultivated alliances, and operated comfortably within a hierarchical political system. On April 4, 1508, Lucrezia gave birth to Ercole d'Este, the long-awaited male heir. He later succeeded his father as Duke of Ferrara. Alexander's blood therefore continued within an established Italian dynasty even after the Borgia name had disappeared from papal government. Lucrezia had several further pregnancies. Following the difficult birth of a daughter in 1519, she developed a severe infection and died on June 24. She was 39 years old. The Spanish line also survived. Juan Borgia's descendants retained the Duchy of Gandia. His grandson, Francis Borgia, became the fourth duke and served as viceroy of Catalonia. After the death of his wife, Francis surrendered his titles and entered the Society of Jesus. In 1565, he was elected its third superior general. He directed the expanding religious order until his death in 1572 and was canonized in 1670. The great-grandson of Alexander VI became a Catholic saint, one of the sharpest contradictions in the family's history. Public memory followed a different path. Anti-papal writers, rival dynasties, chroniclers, dramatists, novelists, and later popular entertainment selected the most sensational Borgia stories because they offered recognizable villains. Lucrezia was assigned crimes associated with her father, her brother, and the political world around them. Her years of administration at Ferrara lacked the dramatic simplicity of a poison ring. Fiction therefore defeated paperwork in the popular imagination. Cesare survived through another literary transformation. Niccolò Machiavelli used him in The Prince to examine how a new ruler acquires power, controls violence, and confronts fortune. That discussion made Cesare a permanent symbol of political ruthlessness. Yet Machiavelli's treatment was not simple praise. Cesare also demonstrated the danger of relying on another man's authority, foreign armies, and unstable mercenaries. His rise and failure belonged to the same lesson. Alexander left an equally divided record. He was an experienced administrator, a patron of art and architecture, and a significant actor in Italian and Atlantic politics. He also practiced open nepotism, monetized ecclesiastical office, used church resources for his children, and tolerated or supported political violence. Removing unsupported stories of secret poison does not remove the documented abuses of his reign. Historical correction is not absolution. The answer to the dynasty's fall is therefore precise. The Borgias did not become extinct in 1503 or 1507. Their Spanish line, Este descendants, and religious influence continued. What collapsed was the attempt to combine an elected papacy, Cesare's territorial state, and hereditary succession into one durable political system. Alexander could grant his son offices and papal vicariates. He could not make the next pope inherit a father's loyalty to that son. This returns the story to August 18, 1503. Alexander was dead, Cesare lay sick, and cities across central Italy began testing whether Borgia commands still carried authority. They did not, because their ultimate source had been one elected man. The system failed not through supernatural punishment, but because patronage, borrowed armies, and papal law could not be converted securely into hereditary rule. The Black Legend endured because it contained both evidence and exaggeration. The Borgias were not innocent victims of history, and they were not supernatural murderers armed with a perfect secret poison. Their power arose from real political institutions. Their corruption produced real victims. Their fall exposed the limits of the institutions they had exploited. When Alexander died, the Borgia family did not disappear. What died was the attempt to make an elected papacy hereditary, and the legend that survived proved far more durable than the dynasty Caesare had tried to build.